Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army in Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and regimental archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 12 and the second part of this look at Vandeleur's Brigade of Cavalry in 1815. In this episode, looking at the 12th Light Dragoons. As always, let's begin by looking at where the men of the regiment were from. At present, I have birthplace data for 307 men of the regiment, so just under 70%. It's a pity this number isn't a bit higher. It's far lower than I've managed to find for most other regiments. But there is hope that the Regimental Museum at Derby does hold a description book with which hopefully the research can one day become more complete. In the meantime, 70% is probably okay as a sample size from which to extrapolate. It's also backed up by a return of the nationalities from autumn 1815, which we'll look at in a moment. So with the data available for those 307 men, 133 were English, 125 Irish, and 49 Scottish. As I said, I'm satisfied this is an accurate indication of the split, especially when you look at the figures from this regimental inspection in late 1815. See here, which shows uncannily similar figures in terms of English, Irish, and Scottish. In terms of counties, for England, by far the most common county of origin was Leicestershire, with almost 40% of Englishmen from there. Ireland had a broader spread, but Monaghan was the most common, especially from Clowness. And for the Scotsmen, 45% came from Lanarkshire. The majority of these Scotsmen were old soldiers who had joined the regiment from the militia all the way back in 1799, from the Lanarkshire Fencible Cavalry. For enlistment dates, I'm not sure that this graph is very clear, but it tries to show that many of the older soldiers who joined the regiment in the early 1790s were Irish. The 10 longest serving soldiers were all Irishmen. Then there was this period around the turn of the century when the recruits were mostly English and Scottish, and that by far the biggest year of intake was 1805, with equal numbers of Irish and English joining then. This was at the end of a posting in Ireland from 1802 to 1805, so perhaps that explains that. Probably the key point here, though, is that the men at Waterloo had been cavalrymen for a considerable time. Of 378 other ranks, 329 had joined the regiment before 1813, so that's 87% of the regiment at Waterloo had been soldiering for 2 years or more. And pretty much all of them would have seen active service in the Peninsula. Although Wellington had in general a pretty low opinion of British cavalry, he'd previously made an exception of the 12th Light Dragoons, who he felt, under the able command of Fred Ponsonby, could be trusted to stop when required and not go galloping off in all directions. Ironically, it would be the 12th who, among all the British light cavalry, showed most impetuosity at Waterloo, and displayed exactly those bad tendencies upon which Wellington frowned. Unlike the unfortunate 11th Light Dragoons, who we looked at in the previous episode, the 12th were a hardened, very experienced regiment, having served throughout the whole of the Peninsula War, and had seen action at Salamanca, Vittoria, Nivelle and Nive, with an extraordinary 17% of the men, even having served as far back as Egypt in 1801. The majority of the men of the 12th at Waterloo would therefore have been adorned with at least one old scar from combat, and many men had survived multiple wounds. For example, Private John Major from Taunton in Somerset bore the scar on his head from a wound received outside Burgos in late 1812. Private Thomas Lodge from Laish had received 2 sabre wounds in the ribs and 1 in the chest at the Battle of Vittoria 2 years before Waterloo. And Henry Dight from South Cadbury in Somerset had received a musket ball in the leg outside Bayonne in December 1813. For anybody researching the 12th, the historian Andrew Bamford has made a special study of them and produced these books. Gallantry and Discipline is an in-depth look at the regiment in this period, And Andrew has also brought together the letters of John Vandeleur, a lieutenant in the 12th and related to Major General John Ormsby Vandeleur, who commanded the brigade. These letters provide a particularly helpful insight into the regiment's Peninsula War campaigning. Another useful source are the memoirs of Lieutenant William Hay, again with a helpful foreword and notes from Andrew. So I'd recommend all of these to anybody who wants to do some further reading. Now let's join the 12th Light Dragoons in 1815. The detachment of the 12th, which was sent to Flanders, comprised 6 troops, and these were commanded by the following officers, listed in order of seniority. Number 1 troop, Sandys. Number 2 troop, Bartons. 5 troop, Staywalls. Number 6, Erskines. Number 7, Andrews. And number 8 troop, Wallaces. As well as the captains listed above, the regiment contained the peculiarity of an extra officer from another regiment. Captain Alexander Crawford was not from the 12th Dragoons. He was in the 2nd Ceylon Regiment, but served in the 12th at Waterloo as a volunteer. In this period, gentlemen sometimes served as volunteers as a way of gaining an officer's commission, and there were several such men who fought in various regiments at Waterloo. But Crawford was already a captain, and therefore not seeking a commission, so it can only be presumed that he came along on the campaign on his own volition, doing so out of curiosity or in the pursuit of glory. Whatever, he must have enjoyed the company of the 12th Dragoons as he transferred into the regiment in 1820. As we heard last time, Vandeleur's brigade did not arrive in time to participate in the Battle of Quatre Bras on the 16th of June, but slept the night on that battlefield before joining the Allied retreat through Genappe in the pouring rain of the 17th, back to the position they would hold at Waterloo the following day. On the 18th, the 12th would see heavier fighting than any other British light cavalry, apart from the King's German Legion, and consequently suffered commensurate heavy casualties. Number 7 troop was to be virtually annihilated. The regiment spent the morning watering their horses and cleaning equipment, then mounted and spent all morning stood in a field of peas. The battle began with an incessant artillery barrage from the French Grand Battery. But while the 3 regiments of cavalry could hear the growing roar of battle, positioned as they were behind the ridge, they could not yet see the enemy. It was only late in the morning that Vandeleur's brigade was brought up to act as support to the 2 brigades of red-tunicked heavy cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, who had charged down into the valley in a devastating impact on the first massed French attack. Arriving at the crest of the slope, the 12th's commanding officer, Fred Ponsonby, gazed out across the valley and was met with what must have been a jaw-dropping sight.
I had a view of the plain between the 2 armies and of the whole of the French position. I saw considerable bodies of French infantry and cavalry in some confusion in the plain, and a good many scattered dragoons in red nearly on the crest of the French position. I felt that these were in the utmost peril unless some support was immediately afforded.
The 12th and 16th were ordered to charge, with the 11th in support. The 2 leading regiments crashed down into the already reeling and bloodied remnants of D'Erlon's massed infantry divisions and set them to rout. But rather than then reforming as they should, a number of the 12th, perhaps the majority of the 6 squadrons, galloped on towards the French Grand Battery, making the same mistake as the heavy cavalrymen whom they'd been sent to support. That is, they got carried away in the excitement and gone charging off towards the French lines, instead of forming up and maintaining discipline. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Ponsonby himself fell amongst the French guns, although he later claimed he was attempting to gather his over-eager men. He was initially believed killed, causing great anguish amongst the regiment. So the same fate awaited the 12th, at least those squadrons which had galloped towards the guns, as that which befell the heavy cavalry which we looked at in episodes 1 to 4. Swarms of French lancers and other light cavalry poured down into their muddled ranks to devastating effect. Captain Alexander Barton, commanding number 2 troop, describes the scene.
We were in considerable confusion, being mixed up with the enemy's broken infantry, suffering at the same time from a heavy cannonade, and before we could regain our position for formation, we were charged by the 3rd and 4th French Lancers, who advanced from behind their own columns of reserve. From this charge, and the heavy fire to which we had been before exposed, we suffered great loss.
Regimental Sergeant Major John Carruthers was in the thick of the action in the combat with the Lancers. Surgeon Smith describes what he heard.
The first Lancer came bravely on, and the gallant Sergeant Major resolved to grapple with him single-handed. The lunge of the Frenchman was dexterously parried, and the sabre in an instant thrust through his body.
Meanwhile, lying near the French guns, Lieutenant Colonel Ponsonby came to. Wounded in both arms in the charge, he'd been dealt a blow from a sabre which had sent him tumbling from his saddle, landing face down on the ground. Raising himself up to look around, a passing French Lancer halted in order to finish Ponsonby off, skewering him through the back with his lance.
My head dropped. The blood gushed into my mouth. A difficulty of breathing came on, and I thought all was over.
The battle still raging, he was then plundered by a French infantryman who threatened to kill him if he did not give up his money. Immediately afterwards, another man came over, and Ponsonby had to explain he'd already been robbed and had nothing more of value. He received kinder treatment from a French officer who placed a knapsack under his head and gave him brandy.
Tenez, monsieur, un peu de brandy. Je vais revenir avec de l'aide. En attendant, essayez de vous reposer et ne bougez pas.
Later in the battle, another French light infantryman appeared.
He knelt down and fired over me, loading and firing many times, and conversing with great gaiety all the while.
Regardez notre splendide cavalerie. C'est la meilleure cavalerie du monde. Et l'empereur est là, en personne, pour la diriger. Je l'ai vu de mes
Later still in the day, Ponsonby was trampled over by Prussian cavalry.
It was dusk when the two squadrons of Prussian cavalry, both of them 2 deep, passed over me in a full trot, lifting me from the ground and tumbling me about cruelly. The clatter of their approach and the apprehensions it excited may be easily conceived. Had a gun come that way, it would have done for me.
Another officer who found himself dismounted was Lieutenant William Hay. He was returning to the British line from the charge when
a shell thrown from the opposite front burst under my horse. One of the splinters hurt his leg so severely that he sat down as a dog would do. At the moment I did not know the cause and used my spurs, but it was to no purpose, and I had therefore to let myself slide over his tail. Then, when trying to kick him up, some men in the hollow lane shouted, telling me to take care of myself. And glancing round, I saw 2 lancers coming full tilt at me. One more instant, and both their lances would have been in the small of my back. One spring into the hollow deprived them of their prey.
Having regrouped, the regiment remained in reserve with the rest of the brigade until around 5 p.m, when it was moved over to the right of the Allied line. The 12th positioned behind the 1st Foot Guards. By this time, the regiment's 3 squadrons had been reduced to 2 as a result of its losses. Assistant Surgeon John Gordon Smith, aged 23, provides interesting insight into the number of combatants that could slip away during a battle.
I was surprised to see detachments of English cavalry marching regularly towards the field. Some had been escorting prisoners and others pretended they had been escorting wounded, but even for these purposes, the numbers seemed far more than sufficient.
In the general advance of the Allied line, the regiment moved forward over the ground, which had only just been contested by the French Imperial Guard and the British Foot Guards and Light Brigade. Lieutenant William Hay recalls,
Bodies were lined so close to each other that our horses could scarcely advance without trampling on them, and a great many were wounded in the fetlocks from the bayonets and other weapons that were scattered about on the field.
As the regiment continued its advance, it came under a sporadic fire from a faltering regiment of French infantry, which soon scattered as the 12th approached. Further in the distance lay the more formidable sight of the French Grenadiers à Cheval of the Imperial Guard, who, entirely unperturbed by the approach of the British line, turned and walked calmly away in what Captain Barton described as a most majestic manner. As darkness fell, the exhausted brigade narrowly avoided tragedy, as we heard in the last episode, their allies the King's German Legion nearly being charged by mistake in the gloom. At last the regiment was able to halt and bivouac for the night. So now let's look at the casualties. My figures don't quite tally with the regiment's own. They have a handful more casualties, which I've not managed to trace, but we're more or less there. I have recorded 42 killed, 56 wounded. As we can see here, if you were a dragoon in the 12th at Waterloo, your chances of survival very much depended on which troop you belonged to. Barton's troop, Staywall's and Erskine's, having relatively moderate casualties. Wallace and Sandy's suffering far worse, and Andrew's troop worse still. The statistics of Andrew's troop resemble some of the household cavalry troops we looked at in episodes 1 to 4 of this podcast, where we saw instances of more men killed than wounded. This is always suspicious. It's not the normal way of warfare, particularly in cavalry combat. And although there's no hard evidence to back it up, my personal theory is that at least some of the 12th were captured and later murdered while prisoners, as we learnt had happened with men from the Household Brigade. One can only feel extremely sorry for wounded soldiers of this period. Whilst this was a transformative period in the study of medicine, in which the understanding of anatomy and subsequent treating of wounds was making significant progress, it's often distressing to read accounts of some treatments which, with modern understanding of infection, seem more likely to have added to the agonies of a wounded individual than done them any real good. Private James Wilkie, the Scotsman from Glamis in Angus, was among the wounded of Andrew's troop. Aged 34, he was a veteran of Egypt and all the years of campaigning in the Peninsula. The following account documents his treatment after Waterloo.
He received a puncture wound from a sword which entered an inch below the inferior angle of the scapula on the left side, penetrated the thorax, and appeared to have passed through the diaphragm, the point of the weapon coming out on the opposite side of the chest, between the first and second false ribs. The wounds were quite healed when on the 6th of September he was suddenly attacked with violent pains in the stomach. Assistant Surgeon Egan bled him, applied hot water to the abdomen and blistered it, and administered castor oil, an emollient and laxatives.
Poor Private Christie died in agony the next day, 81 days after receiving his wound. We last left Lieutenant Colonel Ponsonby badly wounded by the French guns and being trampled by Prussian cavalry. As night fell, he was again rifled for plunder, this time by a German soldier. Help came at last in the form of an English soldier, doubtless also rifling the dead, who stood sentry over him until morning, when he was taken to a farmhouse and placed in the bed from which Sir Alexander Gordon had just been carried out dead. Ponsonby recovered from his wounds, despite the best efforts of Assistant Surgeon Smith, who bled him continually. Ponsonby later became a Major General and lived until 1837. Writing years after the battle, he was wise enough to admit to the error of the British cavalry at Waterloo, including the regiment he led, but also did his best to justify it.
I have said that a good many men fell on the crest of the French position. I know we ought not to have been there, and that we fell into the same error which we went down to correct, but I believe that this is an error almost inevitable after a successful charge, and it must always depend upon the steadiness of a good support to prevent serious consequences. In a great battle, the support is at hand, and I am therefore firmly of opinion that although we sustained a great loss than we should have done if our squadrons had remained compact, the enemy suffered a greater loss, was thrown into more confusion, and required more time to re-establish order than if greater regularity had been preserved.
So, in other words, it was worth it. Of the other wounded men, at least 16 were discharged in the year after the battle due to their Waterloo wounds. Ebenezer Carlyle from Glasgow lost an eye from a gunshot. John Watson from Birmingham, a sabre cut of the left hand and arm. William Rear Johnson from Burton-on-Trent lost a finger and a hand. There were quite a few courts-martial in the period immediately after the battle. For example, Private Richard Lamb, a Dublin man, was court-martialed for being drunk and unfit for duty for the watering parade just 5 days after Waterloo, on the morning of the 23rd of June 1815. You might imagine there'd be some leniency in the circumstances, but no, he was sentenced to 150 lashes and received all 150. In August 1815, Sergeant William Summers from Bourne, Lincolnshire, was court-martialed after it was discovered he had a nice little racket going, demanding and being paid kickbacks from different contractors who supplied the rations to the regiment. He was reduced to private and not promoted again. The number of court-martials continued at a steady rate throughout the years of occupation, with the list of men tried for being out of barracks without permission or drunk on parade being long and uninteresting. However, a closer study of the 12th seems to suggest that something more serious was going wrong in the regiment during these years. Andrew Bamford's study of the 12th is called Gallantry and Discipline, and there seems to have been something of a serious breakdown of the latter in the post-Waterloo years. Now, while nearly all Waterloo regiments' court-martial ledgers are usually fairly similar in terms of the nature of their offence, being a consistent role of being drunk and late, drunk and absent, selling their clothes to buy drink, or pilfering from the local inhabitants, the 12th's list contains a noticeable and serious extra ingredient, that is, insubordination. Here is a roll call of Waterloo men court-martialed for insolence and disrespectful behaviour during the 3 years of occupation in France.
Using insolent and threatening language to Troop Sergeant Major Griffith.
Insolence and disrespect to Sergeant Cartwright.
Being insolent and disrespectful to Corporal Kelly and refusing to be confined by him.
Making use of insolent language to the Commandant of Boulogne and challenging him to a fight on the road between Boulogne and Molenbeek.
Being in liquor and using threatening language to Sergeant Cooper.
In using disrespectful language against Adjutant Griffith.
Irregular behaviour on parade.
And issuing improper language to Corporal Fuchs.
Using insolent
being
language.
drunk on
Sergeant
disrespectful language to Corporal.
It's worth noting that with the exception of Walter Butler, who appears twice on the list, these are all different individuals, 20 different private soldiers. It's not the usual case of the same 2 or 3 men repeatedly getting drunk and getting into trouble. And remember, these are just the Waterloo men. There are countless others from the new recruits who joined the regiment in France. It does seem to show a significant breakdown of order, especially in terms of the non-commissioned officers losing control over the private soldiers. The year after Waterloo, the regiment received an order of great magnitude. The 12th were to be armed with the lance, and given the prolix title of 12th the Prince of Wales Regiment of Light Dragoons Lancers. This was later shortened to just the 12th Lancers. It's ironic that the 12th would already know all too well just how effective a weapon the lance could be. Many men of the regiment bearing the scars from the attack of the French Lancers in the valley between the two armies at Waterloo. Indeed, Private Benjamin Thompson, a Leicester man, had to be discharged in 1816 due to
a lame arm from several pike wounds at Waterloo.
These were almost certainly lance wounds, not pike wounds, but interesting that the word lance was often still referred to as a pike at this point. Private James McDaniel from Fermanagh was also listed as receiving
2 pike wounds in the right shoulder and a ball through the right thigh.
And Lieutenant John Vandeleur, in a letter home after Waterloo, reports that Lieutenant Colonel Ponsonby had been piked through the body. Private John Barnett from Batcombe in Somerset also received lance wounds, one in his left side and one in his left arm. It might be pushing it, but I find it interesting the wounds came from the left. I can picture the French lancers swarming in from the east of the battlefield. Is it also significant that both these 2 men were in Staywell's No. 5 troop? Perhaps that was the leftmost troop of the regiment, or maybe that's too much speculation. There were other lance victims in Sandy's troop, Private Adam Whitlow from Leith in Midlothian, discharged in 1816 due to a lance through the body, and in Andrew's troop, Private John Morrow from Tipperary, in the regiment since 1794 and a trumpeter in Egypt, was wounded at Waterloo by a lance in the hand. So what became of these Waterloo men of the 12th? Well, nothing as exotic or indeed tragic as the fate of the other Light Dragoon regiments in Vandeleur's brigade, the 12th escaping the death sentence of a posting to the East Indies. Instead, after 3 years in France as part of the Army of Occupation, the regiment finally returned home in October 1818, and 2 months later, just before Christmas, while stationed at Canterbury, a very large number of the men were discharged. This mass discharge in December 1818 must presumably have led to a large number of old soldiers milling around in Canterbury with nowhere to go and with nothing to do but drink their new pensions away. As we heard in our previous episode, This led to an almighty brawl with men of the 11th Light Dragoons, also then stationed in Canterbury, on the evening of Wednesday the 16th of December. The local newspaper, the Kent Chronicle, reported that the punch-up had arisen
out of some reflections cast by the 12th on the character of the 11th while on service in France, and each regiment armed themselves and were marched in divisions under the orders of their non-commissioned officers to the scene of the action, and had become regular combatants when, by the intervention of the infantry depot who were called out, the quarrel was suppressed, with some loss of blood on both sides. A number of the 12th, forming part of the 250 to be disbanded from that regiment, received their discharge on that day.
Much of the British Army endured similar large reduction. Now that peace was looking permanent, it was too expensive for the country to maintain such a large standing army. So, within 5 years after the battle, around 50% of the Waterloo men were gone. Most men would have set off on the long walk home and tried to find employment in the villages and towns they had left, often decades earlier. One man who did not was Sergeant James Irwin. Born in Clowness, Monaghan, he had enlisted in the 12th in 1809 and fought his way through the Peninsula, being present at the sieges of Rodrigo and Badajoz, Burgos and San Sebastian, and at the battles of La Reina, Salamanca, Vitoria and Toulouse. A corporal by 1814, he was then promoted to sergeant just 3 weeks before Waterloo, where he fought in Wallace's troop. Among those 250 men discharged in Canterbury in December 1818, the very next day he strolled over to the barracks in which the 11th Light Dragoons were quartered and re-enlisted as a private. One can't help but wonder how he was received by the men there, many of them presumably sporting black eyes and broken noses. But with the 11th, he rose again to sergeant within a year, went with them to India, survived the ordeals we heard of in the last episode, was present at the siege of Bhurtpore, and was only discharged in 1838, one of the last Waterloo men still serving in the regiment. There were no such distant shores, though, for the 12th Lancers. Instead, they spent the 1820s either stationed along the south coast of England or in Ireland. The story of Private James McKenna is a distressing case. Another man from Clowness, County Monaghan, he had served with the regiment since a boy of 15 in 1807. In 1824, while stationed in Cork and for reasons unknown, he attempted suicide by shooting himself with one of his pistols. Tragically, he succeeded only in shooting away the lower part of his jaw and was subsequently discharged. Having studied thousands of discharge papers held at the Public Record Office at Kew, this man's are unique in that he has written his own comment on them. In the section for conduct, the officer completing the form has written bad. Next to this, McKenna has written, presumably in great anger,
God knows, my conduct was always good.
Another sad tale is that of Assistant Surgeon John Smith, who attended the wounds of his commanding officer Frederick Ponsonby after the battle. An Edinburgh man, he later published The English Army in France and a work on medical jurisprudence, an early guide to forensic medicine. Upon the opening of London University in 1828, he became the first professor of medical jurisprudence. However, he spiraled into debt through drink and what a newspaper referred to as irregular habits, ending up in the Fleet prison as a debtor and dying there after 15 months in 1833. For the remaining Waterloo men of the 12th, there would be one more sojourn abroad. In 1826, British troops were sent to Lisbon to aid the Portuguese government. And the extent to which this expedition has been forgotten about by history is remarkable. At least it has been in the English-speaking world. There's not even a Wikipedia page about it. But 4 troops of the 12th Lancers, commanded by Alexander Barton, now promoted to Major, formed part of this British force and embarked at Portsmouth in December for Portugal, where they remained for almost 2 years. By this point, however, there were fewer than 60 Waterloo rank and file remaining in the regiment. There were several old soldiers who lived into their dotage. Private Thomas Durrance from Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire died in the almshouse there in 1871, aged 86. But almost certainly the last living Waterloo man of the 12th was Private Samuel Melmer, living in the village of Holwell in Dorset in 1881, aged 86, with his wife Eliza. So that brings us to the end of this episode 12. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Remember, you can also download the podcast to listen to it. The link is here in the blurb, and you can also find it on Spotify and so on. Enormous thanks, as always, to the fantastic contributors to this podcast for reading the extracts. And also, if anybody listening would like to help out in future and read a line or two, do please get in touch. The email is also on the blurb. Next time, we'll look at the third and final regiment in this brigade, the 16th Light Dragoons. So see you next time, and thank you very much for listening.